All right, let's begin. I'm happy to welcome Marv Goldschmitt to our bridge interview series today. Uh, Today represents something of an interesting, almost mirror image of what we have done for the last nearly 10 years with our interviews. Historically, we have interviewed engineers who have done something in their lives that goes beyond what you expect of engineers. So we have interviewed singers and dancers and poets and writers and politicians and rock band musicians and so on. And today we're actually going to take that and reverse it a bit. We're gonna talk with Marv Goldschmidt, who is a psychologist by training, but who has spent his much of his career, most of his career in the high-tech industry. And we're going to talk with Marv about a subject of great interest to the public, and in fact, the subject of our spring issue of the Bridge, which is on artificial intelligence. We'd like to get Marv's take from his perspective as someone who is deeply involved with high tech for many years, from the point of view of a psychologist and as someone very deeply interested in social values. So, Marv, I want to welcome you. I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about your background, your childhood, your education, and then we'll get back, then we'll go into the depths of AI. And I have some questions I'd like to address to you, and we'll start with that. Marv, tell us about your background.
Well, Ron, Kyle, thank you for inviting me. Um, so diving right into my background, I sort of had an unusual beginning to life. I'm the son of which affected, by the way, a lot of what I'm going to talk about. Both my parents were Holocaust survivors. My father spent 4 years in Auschwitz. My mother was slave labor on German U-boats as a young girl. So I grew up in a fairly non-traditional household. My parents were pretty broke, to be honest, and were just trying to survive and give their children, I have a sister, an opportunity in life. But they were not really enculturated in America. They didn't understand anything about America. Both of them were fairly uneducated. So from the beginning, my beginning, I've always known that, I was different from my friends who had large families and whatnot. And there were things that interested me that my parents had no understanding of. So I was pretty much of a self-starter as a child, self-navigator. And that included, you know, finding my way to the top science high school in the world, Bronx High School of Science, when I had an intent to become a theoretical physicist. Then I met the people who were going to get Nobel Prizes and realized that wasn't my strength. But I was the one who drove myself in that direction. But I would say my parents' experience sensitized me that the world is not as it appears, that things are not as reliable as you'd like it to be, whether it's governmental or it's relationships. Uh, and and so I was always about the world. And a large part, which brought me eventually to being a psychologist, was curiosity about how people thought and how they could do certain things to other people. And also how they didn't necessarily seem to make the best decisions for themselves. So when I was at Bronx Science in the late 1960s, and that was a pretty roiling period. That was, civil rights, that was the Vietnam War, and we were very involved. And it was hippie movement. And I must admit, I found a lot of solace in involving myself with that. And eventually, through a long period, um, became involved with the Beatles guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, in Transcendental Meditation, and worked with them for about 7 years, and with Maharishi. Lived with him in Europe, in Canada, and in California, and started developing more of an appreciation for human potential, and that moved me to becoming a psychologist. It also I saw a lot of people in pain as a psychologist, and I wanted to help them. that was something that was quite interesting to me, and I don't mean it in an intellectual way, emotionally, given what my family history was. But there came a point, and I must say, a particular day in late April of 1979, when a friend of mine, who is pretty well known these days, Mitch Kapor, my wife to be and I were living with him in Cambridge. And the first day we moved in, he introduced me to an Apple II computer. My life changed. It changed for a very particular reason. I realized what it was. I realized that for the first time, a minute of human time was worth more than an hour of computing time. I had done work before on computers, on IBM 360s and such as a researcher, and my time was useless. The computer's time was valuable. I would do punch cards and wait a day to get results, to get a stack of green printouts that told me all the errors. I did another set of punch cards, waited another day or 2 days or a week sometimes to get results. My time was valueless. Its time was valuable. The Apple II swapped that around, and I realized that now that computing power would be under people's control, an individual's control. And to give you an idea, within 2 months, I was working in the third oldest computer store in the world, and helped introduce VisiCalc to the world, which is essentially the world's first spreadsheet, developed by Dan Bricklin, who invented the spreadsheet, and Bob Frankston, who created the first program for the Apple II. And that was the program that changed the world. 3 years later, I was the head of business development and marketing at a startup called Lotus Development. And I was responsible for the introduction of what many people consider to be the killer app of the computer industry, Lotus 123. That launched me. I got to be, I think of myself as almost the ultimate tourist. I had the world presented to me. If I hadn't walked into Mitch's bedroom and saw the Apple II, my life might have taken a very different path. And I've had, since the beginning of the introduction of manipulable technology into people's lives, I've been involved in virtually every leading edge since then. And that includes doing things like something that leads to my concern about AI. In 1994, I filed the first patent for advertising-supported services on the internet, free email. I filed the patent that showed how to use banner ads and all that. At the time, I understood that it was problematic potentially, and in fact, almost did not bring it to my partners, but had the thought that while I understood, I'd know more about what people thought, what they did, than probably they knew about themselves. I didn't understand the greater potential that we were all seeing from that. I thought that the balance was better, that humanity had something like free email than the risk. That was a judgment I made. But it actually leveraged on a long-term concern I had, which we can get into, about the nature of data. And that may be something we want to explore. So I came to this whole thing from an unusual background and great opportunities, and to be honest, just being a curious person.
You've said several things, Marv, that really intrigue me. I mean, number one, you have this initiative to help people. That's an important point. And to get to AI in a contextual sense, we've been living with AI for decades. Most people probably don't realize that. But in November of 2022, the world changed dramatically with the introduction of GPT. And even more so today, the world is changing with the arrival of AI, or maybe AGI induced, artificial general intelligence induced agents who can who are allegedly capable of reasoning and thinking and planning and serving as companions to the elderly and so on. I just wonder what your thoughts are on all of that. How do you look at this? I'm thinking of your comment about wanting to help people because there's a lot of interest in robotic companions who are trained with AGI. What's your take on all of that?
Well, let's start off by a simple belief I have, and I'm not alone in this. AI is the single most important invention in human history. It's the only, we have always, I shouldn't say always, since the beginning of agriculture and animal husbandry around 12,000 years ago, we have basically tried to manipulate the environment for our benefit. So we invent things that are extensions of us that can do things we couldn't do, that make it easier, tools.
Yeah,
Uh, we learned to communicate, print. There are many major inventions, but all of those were tools. And what I mean by a tool is something that is purpose built and that is under human control. AI is something I've been concerned about for a very long time. The AI that exists, AI in a sense began, and I be very precise, 89 years ago. In 1936, Alan Turing, who people, that's a name people know,
yeah.
but they may not know where they know it from. They know it from a movie, I think it was called The Imitation Game. Alan Turing was the person who broke the German Enigma code.
Yes.
That was, and he was credited by many people with breaking the not just the code, but the German hold and the potential for them to win the war. But he was the father, in many senses, of where we are today in computing. And when he wrote the first paper in 1936, he suggested these could be thinking machines. AI, the idea that they could be thinking machines, that they could, and in fact, Dennis Hassabis, who won the Nobel Prize and is head of AI at Google, Demis he invented AlphaFold, so he won the Nobel Prize just last year. He said that AI, he had the simplest definition of it. AI is simply making machines smart. And that was what Turing conceived of. That was something which was a goal of computing from day one, not by the people who were paying for it. Those were people, who wanted to break codes, who wanted to, develop manuals for artillery. And that's what AI was originally, I shouldn't say AI, computers were originally used for in the 1940s.
Yeah.
But the scientists, they started from day one thinking that this really could mirror the human functionality. And in fact, Turing's famous for the Turing test, which is to see when computers would become indistinguishable from humans.
Yeah.
So without teaching or preaching too much, AI has been the interest of the scientists of computing since day one. But it hit a lot of what's called AI winters, where things didn't work. Some things did. We had things called expert systems, symbolic logic machines in the 70s and 80s. But it wasn't until the 1990s that AI started to actually work. But it did it in a way that was different from the way most people understood it to be. And in fact, it started infiltrating people's lives in the early 2000s. Specifically, social media would not exist. Netflix would not exist without AI. AI is pattern matching and things that suggest to you this should be a friend, or maybe this is something you want to read. That was AI that was manipulating people.
Right.
I became aware of it. And I became hyper aware of it. And I will get to your question, Ron, but I have to lay the foundation. I became hyper aware of it in around 1998, 99, when I was helping build the first very large scale data warehouse for healthcare for the Ford Motor Company. We had 30 years of healthcare records on 1 million covered lives. And we were going to analyze it and be able to ask questions, what happens here and there. And then the UAW came in. And the UAW got very upset because we were dealing with this incredibly sensitive data about their members. And we, and I mean we, everybody, had given that almost no thought. And I became very sensitized to the degree to which the data, which 5 years earlier, when I filed that patent, I helped sort of begin to create data about people, that data was not just incredibly valuable and important and usable and researchable, it was also very dangerous.
Yeah.
So I co-founded a data auditing company, security auditing company, and people didn't understand the degree to which everything that they were and had was being translated into data, and that data wasn't just something they didn't control, but it was something that was being used to a large degree to manipulate them, like Netflix saying, if you like this movie, you might like that movie, or
Yeah.
social media saying this or that, or more behind the scenes, no, you don't get admitted to a college. No, um, your finances, you don't get a mortgage, or you do get a mortgage. That was all being handled by AI in the background. It was still tool-oriented AI in that it was under human control, but most people weren't aware of it. And
Right.
that AI very much concerned me, and particularly AI, and I started a company around this, that was being used to screen people's resumes by companies before a human being ever saw them. And then people never heard back and whatnot. So I actually started a company to counteract that. At that time, I was invited to join the IBM Data Governance Council, which was a policy group within IBM to create the policies of how does data get managed. And I was in charge of privacy and security policy. The AI we were dealing with then, to get to November 22nd, was very dangerous. I was there when Watson was being developed, if you remember Watson from Jeopardy. That was the first situation where I saw a system not just learning, but very directly being told by the developers they didn't know how it worked, that they didn't know why it was learning. In fact, it hadn't learned. It failed when they started testing it against third graders repetitively. And then all of a sudden started beating fifth graders and eighth graders and high school graduates and college students. And they didn't understand why. That really, I must admit, scared me, because I realized we invented something that was incredibly important and most people didn't know about it. William Gibson, science fiction writer, had the perfect line about this. He said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So to a certain degree, I got into a campaign, my balance beam. When I came up with the idea of advertised supported email, I knew there were risks, but my balance was that it was much better for society. My
Yeah.
balance beam went like, and so the things that we have seen over the last 7 years, and it's just 7 years, were predictable. But I will tell you, nobody that I was involved with anticipated what happened November 30th, 2022, for another decade to 2 decades. And that concluded the people who invented it, like Jeffrey Hinton.
Yeah.
We
But
will,
let me jump in for a minute. I mean, I know there are a lot of people who are addressing this history, and but I'd really like to turn to the question of the concept, given that history and where we are today, the concept of a robotic companion. And I say it for this reason. I mean, I think of myself and suppose I were interested in a robotic companion. I'm sure that a machine or an agent could be trained to understand my typical day. I get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, I read the newspaper, and then I start working, et cetera, et cetera. But suppose the agent were to be trained on some misinformation or information that is not verifiable, and How would I manage that? I mean, that's a concern to me.
I think that is the probably, in the broader sense, that's the largest concern we have for humanity. In that these things do learn, they also don't forget, they share information among themselves. And what I mean by that is, if you use ChatGPT, you're having a private conversation with it, or so you think.
Yeah,
They're storing all those conversations, save that for training future models, and therefore everything it learns from you or whatnot, or anything it does or knows about your life will be shared.
yeah,
Um, that the evolution of where we are with AI, when you're talking about robotics, when you're talking about agentry, let me try to put it in some context. When ChatGPT came out, and I literally found out about it within hours, it was just a blog post, and I was using it at night because it came out, later in the day on November 30th. I was lying in bed with my cell phone trying it out. I didn't sleep that night because I realized we had crossed a Rubicon. But it was one sideshow event. It could talk to me. It responded. It was great. It was a similar, limited capability, but amazing capability. That was 2.25 years ago. Look at where we've gone since then. We
yeah,
went from this interesting little thing that nobody knew about to video generation, to systems like Pi from Inflection, that actually learn in real time, and to AI being applied to virtually everything. You cannot turn on anything now without hearing the words AI and having massive amounts of money being thrown at it, which means there's value in it, which means it works. But it's not one thing. That's, I think, the biggest concern I've got when you talk about agents or you talk about robotics. This isn't AI. These are applications of AI. AI is a way of thinking model. How does you make a computer think? And it
yeah,
can be applied to lots of different things. So you can, right now, it is immobile. What I mean by that? It sits inside a large computer somewhere, lots of large computers in a cloud, but it doesn't walk among us. It's not learning in the environment. That's changing. And when you get to agentry and you get to robotics, we're talking about things that live among us, agents that we give control of our life to. Now, many people think of it rather positively. Um, so you want an agent, if you're going to go on vacation, pick out the best hotel for me and the best program for me and the best rates, and find a weekend when there isn't going to be a celebration going on in town that I can't go and experience what I want to experience, and give it away and come back with an itinerary and have booked. You even given it your ability to sign on to Expedia or whatever and create your actual reservations and pay for it and do all that. That's seductive to people. Another thing that's seductive is for students in education. Come up with an agent that teaches them algebra. These are systems that become personalized for somebody that can do things, and this is important, especially when you're talking about like using a credit card, do things in the real world. So what they've done is cross over from just being this thing you talk to being something that's actually functioning in the world. It's manipulating the world. CrowdStrike um, error that took, if you remember it, it took down the
Yeah.
air traffic control system, actually the scheduling systems and all that.
yeah,
That was all because specific types of computers, lots of them, 11 million of them, that control physical things in the world went haywire, shut down. That tells you when these things cross over into the real world, they have impact, they have control. And if we give them thinking ability, which CrowdStrike didn't, it was just a bug, then they can actually manipulate that. Give yourself a robot, as you were saying, that's living in the real world. It's very interesting. I'm getting older. Would I be interested in having a healthcare robot as I get older and become infirm? Yeah, it's a seductive idea. Um, but the implications of that are much greater. When we look at AI, especially chatbots, which everybody's familiar with, chatbots are not AI. They're
yeah,
not, they're a subsection of AI. But see, it's what people interact with. It's not the AI I was originally concerned about, which, by the way, is now called GoFi, good old-fashioned AI. The AI
Yeah.
that manipulated your credit ratings or your ability to get a job. Um, this AI is what people are familiar with, and they're seeing a change quickly, but they habituate and they fall in line with it. They're not realizing the degree to which it's starting to take control. What you're suggesting with robotics, where they're living in our world, where they're receiving information like we do. And by the way, receiving information we don't,
But
right?
what I'm concerned about, though, is the following. I mean, I'm interested in this because I know some people who are involved.
Mm-hmm.
But I can imagine an agent, a robot, companion, watching me or being coming familiar with my habits. But I could also imagine someone who wanted to be malicious, giving that robot, that agent, some information which says, well, at breakfast, instead of reading the New York Times, he has a scotch and soda. Or,
Mm-hmm.
or or he drinks a Manhattan every afternoon at lunchtime, or and which is not my character. I don't do that. It's not that I don't enjoy alcohol, but I don't usually have it at breakfast. How do you prevent that? I mean, I worry about the fact that there is so much potential for misinformation and disinformation being integrated into the agent's experience base, which is what they're drawing on, right? When they're companions. How do you prevent that?
Well, that's a very good question. And I'll start off by telling you right now, I have no idea. A matter of fact, I don't honestly think it is preventable. I think one of my biggest concerns is that people don't realize that this is not something which can be turned on or off. There's
Yeah.
no off button in AI. And it's very endearing. Think about the implications. It's very hard to tease AI out from from thinking about how it affects every aspect of our lives. All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a very simple thing. When you say misinformation, that let's distinguish that from bad data. These things are being trained on data.
Yeah.
When I said I helped build that healthcare information data, the first healthcare information system, we discovered that 40% of all the healthcare records had a potentially fatal error in it. That was not intentional. The systems were being trained on bad data, which could kill somebody.
Yeah.
So when you look at the data, so the name GPT, everybody knows that. Generative pre-trained transformer. Let me first make the point that the idea of a transformer, which is the basis of how these things work in terms of talking to us and interacting with us, only was introduced to the world in 2017 in a paper from Google called Attention is All You Need. So everything you're seeing, I said we can take AI back 89 years. This AI, generative AI, goes back 7 years.
Okay.
And all of this has happened since. So the trajectory of its intrusion into our lives is just breathtaking. And I think that's the biggest shock to those of us who've been involved in this for a long time, is not that it happened, it's how quickly and pervasively it's happening. So the answer to your question is that pre-training is using data that was, and I put this in quotes, curated. For people who are non-engineers, and I appreciate that I'm not an engineer, and to those of you who are watching who are, um, I have a more generalist point of view. But to people who have no understanding of engineering at all, the thing they need to understand about this is that it's accelerating at a rate much faster than we can understand and that we can cope with. So when you're talking about data that has been pre-trained on,
Yeah.
that data is essentially the library of everything anybody ever thought was worth digitizing. Now think about it for a second. By analogy, let me give you an analogy. Pre-training a large language model, an LLM, which is what all these systems are being used for,
Yes.
um, that is like taking a 10-year-old brilliant child who grew up in isolation and drop them off in the reference room of a library. and tell them the only thing you can learn from is what's in that library right now, that in
Yeah.
that room. Don't talk to anybody. And so it's going to learn from pre-curated data information. And any one of those sources of information, because they're human generated, could be wrong. That's why you had the Botanical Encyclopedia and you had the World Book. So you could cross-reference, which is missing something, which says has a different interpretation. When we train these LLMs on everything that's on the internet or every tweet that Elon Musk owns through buying Twitter, what we're saying is learn on this data that somebody thought was valuable enough, meaning curated, to have digitized. Distinguish that from taking that same child and dropping him off in Times Square or the middle of the woods, where it's learning from its environment.
Yeah.
When you're talking about agents, when you're talking about robotics, these are making these things more in the world rather than just curating data and
Yes.
giving it
Yeah.
to it, say, learn on this. So forget for the moment the issue of maliciousness. I know it's really seductive to go in that direction. Everybody talks about it, and I'm very concerned about it. I'm more concerned about what happens if nobody's malicious.
Mm.
An example of that does show up in social media. And Sherry Turkle at MIT started writing about this in 1995 with her first book, Life on the Screen. To her most recent book, I think, was called Alone Together. What does this mean for human interaction? You're concerned about that maybe you had one drink one day because you stayed up all night, and now that's part of your record. Yes, the surveillance world is a risk. And all you have to do is looking at the social index scores in China, which are generated to a large degree by AI, to realize that's a real risk. But for me, the biggest risk, and this goes to my background as a psychologist, is that we're disintermediating humans. What do I mean by disintermediating? We're taking humans out of the middle of this. So when you're having that robot working for you or that agent working for you, where's the human you're talking to? The whole thing, the imagery we have of people sitting around the dining room table, everybody, the father, the mother, and the kids having a cell phone in their hand, they're not communicating with each other.
Right.
But what we're doing is disintermediating humans from the process. There's a lot, it's hard to tease it out, I was saying, from everything else that's going on in life. It's clearly a part of the social fabric disintegration we're seeing. It's clearly a part of either a solution or a magnification of the issues related to the environment. We can't tease it out. It's in everything. And there are good effects of it. But when you look at the global effects of it that we have created, and I think if there's a takeaway, this is the takeaway. We have created something that no longer accepts us as being the alpha problem solvers in the universe. Research just published in the last 2 weeks came out showing that people who use chatbots, scientists who use chatbots,
Yeah.
work with them and let them make, analyses. And with the more advanced versions now that people aren't aware of, the deep reasoning things that you talked about, like O3 from OpenAI or R3 from DeepSeek, I could go down the list. These things are like having a postdoc working for you. They're incredibly reasoning. They can take over and do very complicated things. They've shown that scientists who use those have a decreased use of their own critical thinking. The implications of this for what we are as humans is really the big question.
Yeah.
What does it mean if we're not the alpha intellects, the alpha problem solvers on this planet? One of the mistakes everybody's making, you mentioned AGI before. AGI stands for essentially the Turing test, artificial general intelligence, an artificial intelligence that could do anything, not purpose built, not a tool. But we're also using ourselves as the yardstick. Why would that be the yardstick? We also talk about ASI. Ray Kurzweil, who has been the strategist at Google, and a lot of other people know him for things going back to the 60s in artificial intelligence, creating for Stevie Wonder, the first machine that could read a book for him and talk to him about it, uh,
Mhm.
reads it to him. He predicts in his most recent book, and he's been doing this for 20 odd years, that we're going to merge with computers by the year 2046. What does all this mean for humanity? These are my questions. We can't go great depth into that today, but that's
Yeah.
what I'd like people to think about. Your questions are good doors into that, but you could ask it about everything. There's a service now. As I said, I was a concert photographer. I mentioned it before we talked. My other background, there's a book behind me that I published. Um, I know a lot of A class musicians. There's a product out there. Those of you who are interested in looking at it, Suno, SUNO.ai, a service that produces music that I have seen from top musicians frighten them because it's as good as what they write. Just the
Mhm.
same way people are experiencing that visually.
Let me jump in for a minute because
But the question is, what's our role? That's really the question.
yeah. Well, I have a general impression that the generative AI or ASI, AGI can be supremely useful, but I'm
Mhm.
deeply concerned that it can be supremely dangerous and abusive. And I keep wondering, is it possible that we could train agents and on data that we know is valid or in experiences that we know are valid and therefore there you reduce the risk that they're going to become malicious? Can you imagine a time when think forward 20 years, 10 years, whatever it is. Can you
Yeah.
imagine AI being its own, its own corrective vehicle as well as it brilliant capabilities that it does have?
Well, to your last question, I would say I can't imagine it, but how we get there is very dangerous. Let
Very,
me, to answer your first question
yeah,
about essentially control,
yeah,
whether controlling the data that it's trained on,
yeah.
well, that's potential there. I'm going to negate this in a second. Potentially there when you're putting the child or the AI in the reference room, when you put them in Times Square and have them learn from full experience, which Fei Li, who I know has an article that's been published by the Bridge, um, who is one of the true leaders, is working on systems that learn spatially, learn
Mhm.
in motion, can go traveling robotically, and learn from its experience.
Right.
Therefore, that training is not based on information that you're talking about, which is curated.
Yeah.
But let me answer it another way, and let me be very blunt. The question of control of AI is not possible. It's not that's not going to happen. It's not even possible. I call it the fallacy of control. And there are two components to that. The first component is who
Hmm.
sets the standard? What does it mean? The word that keeps coming up is ethics. Everybody talks about ethics. What does that mean? How do you get anybody in the world to agree on ethics? Will the Taliban agree on ethics with us? Probably not. But society, culture, individuals define ethics for themselves. So
It's all about how people use it, isn't it?
it's, well, in order to control the things, you have to know what you want to control. And that
Mm.
starts off with an understanding of what's good and what's bad for humanity. That's ethics. That's not something we've ever agreed on. And we're certainly not showing that now. So the first problem with control is we don't know what we even want to control. The second problem is this technology is already out of control. And in fact, 2 years ago, everybody whose names you know today, Musk, Altman, Hinton, and I, signed a letter asking for a 6-month moratorium. This was in May of 2023 on the development of LLMs, large language models, because of their risk. Those are the people who are now, with the exception of Hinton in that list, who are pushing this forward as fast as they can. The US government is. JD Vance spoke 2 months ago at a conference on AI with all world leaders in Paris, and they were all concerned about it. And he said, we're going pedal to the metal. all gas, no brakes. And that's what you've seen. The announcements of the administration to develop data centers all over the place, reactivate nuclear reactors to generate the energy for it. This is out of control. And the thing we don't understand is these things are controlling themselves. Again, more research. Research in the last 2 months, and by the way, both Microsoft and Google have admitted this, that their systems will lie without them knowing about it to protect themselves or to accomplish a larger goal. The research is supported. I can give you all the references. This is all good research. So along with the critical thinking one and reams of it, because everybody who is in the space is concerned. There's nobody who's not. It's just that they are making the judgment that either for personal reasons or country reasons, patriotic reasons, or financial reasons, or maybe they believe on balance will be good, that not controlling this is the best way to go.
You
I
know,
and that
I'm sensitive to the time, and we're getting close to the end of our hour long. But I have one other question I want to ask, and maybe this would be a way of closing our conversation. You know, most of the technological systems and devices that we use are standardized. There are some standard ASTM standards that apply to the use of X, Y, or Z. Do you see any potential for standardizing the evolution of agents or systems derived from AI?
okay. I'm going to do a little show and tell here.
Okay, okay.
These two little metal things are from 1948. They're the first commercial, actually weren't commercial. These were sent by Bell Labs to researchers. These are the first transistors ever made.
Ah, okay. Yep.
People don't understand how rapidly this is changing, which gets to the question of standardization. You can only standardize that which is somewhat stable. Would you like to guess how many of those are now in Blackwell, the advanced GPU from NVIDIA?
Yeah.
I would give you a very different number a year ago.
Yeah.
208 billion of them.
Hmm.
A year ago, it was less than 100 billion. The acceleration of, let me leave you with another, maybe a little frightening, Frankenstein, literally Frankenstein image. We are dealing with Lego parts right now. Functionalities. You've heard about them. Sora produces video.
Yeah.
Suno produces music. Um, different picture generators like DALL-E.
Yeah.
Uh, different chatbots, which focus in different areas. These are all capable, some things that learn, some things that can work with robots, like neuromorphic computing. These are little capabilities. It's like walking into Dr. Frankenstein's lab 6 months before he knits together the monster. And what you might see on one lab table is an arm that flexes. You might see an eyeball that if you shine light in it, the pupil changes. All amazing stuff, but they're not snapped together yet. As things are rapidly changing, we're developing new capabilities that are snapping together. Doc Edgerton at MIT in the 40s develops high-speed photography. And we've all seen the pictures of a bullet going through a light bulb or an apple.
Yeah.
The thing to understand is we froze a moment in time. The bullet, before the picture was even fully taken, was gone.
Right.
To control something, you have to have it stable. The bullet still needs to be in the apple. It's gone. These things are developing so quickly, so rapidly, and we evolve so slowly, both organically and socially, that's one of my biggest concerns. We're not capable of keeping up with this. So how do you standardize something? And this is part of the fallacy of control. How do you standardize something in order to, standards are a control mechanism to control it. When these things are changing so quickly, when everybody's got their own lab creating their little Lego pieces like DeepSeek, not under US control, and snapping them together to create the next generation an hour later. Every time I spend a good 8 hours a day, probably 7 days a week on AI. Every time I play with a bot, I learn something new. And I can't even tell if I'm discovering something that's been in there for a while or they just introduced it an hour ago
Yeah.
because this thing is changing so quickly, they don't even document it.
Ron, actually, I do have a question. I'm just gonna jump in here. I mean, Marv, you've laid out a number of very, serious concerns about AI, for our readers and viewers to consider. I'm wondering if, zooming out and thinking about people, just kind of out in the world, like, people who are seeing AI or not seeing AI become like more and more intertwined with their lives. Like, what message would you kind of communicate to people about how they interact with AI? Like, would you, given everything that you've said, like, what kind of message would you communicate to people who are, just out there living their lives, and how would you advise people to engage with this?
I lie awake at night asking myself the same question because in one sense it's easy to sort of become very Ludditerish. But the thing is that doesn't stop this from progressing. It's also, as Ron pointed out, there are benefits to this. There's lots of research showing that this can help people. I think the biggest concern I have is that people do not have foresight. They do not necessarily make decisions in their own long-term best interest. I see a very dangerous three stages. There's the short term, which people are going to recognize in their life in some very painful ways soon, economically. This gets a little out in the weeds, except this happened last night. And this, not a slam at the current administration, but there's evidence, and I mean real evidence, that the tariff plan was generated by AI.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
can give you the evidence of that. This is invading every part of people's lives. And there's something happening with this that's different from anything else that we've ever done before with technology. And that is, this will be edited, but I was going to tell you the story about Henry Ford. Henry Ford recognized that he had a problem in the 1910s. And that was that the people buying his car were relatively wealthy and had the time and the money to utilize it. And he realized he was going to run out of those people. So what he did was he doubled the daily salary of his employees and cut the work week to 8 to 40 hours. Why? Because then his employees and other employees following could afford to buy his vehicle and they could have the time to drive it on the weekends or whenever they were free, go out in the country. That changed society. But what it did was it created a new consuming and producing wealthier class. These systems are not creating, they replaced, I mean, the car replaced people, replaced everybody in the equestrian world. But it created new jobs, new capabilities, new wealth. AI is not doing that. AI will replace people. There's a company called Klarna, which everybody knows about. They experience it. Every time you see on TV an ad for buy now, pay later, that's from a Swedish company called Klarna, who is the backbone of that. In January of 2024, they had 1,400 people with wires growing out of their head doing customer support. In April, they had 700. They replaced them with AI bots. There was no new job, no new revenue, no new products that people were buying. So it's going to strike people pretty hard economically, not just that they're going to lose jobs because they're being replaced, but there are no new jobs are being created for them. People need to understand, to your question, Kyle, that this is going to affect every aspect of their lives quickly. They shouldn't treat this as just another thing. It's not a cell phone. It's not, oh, I've integrated that into my life. This is not a tool. This is something that's going to affect every part of your life independently. When I may say independently from your control of it. It will decide what to do. We're seeing that, the lying capabilities that have been documented. It will learn, as we're discovering with a lot of tools and Fei-Fei Li's work. It'll live in the environment with us. Look at robotic cars. Again, back to what William Gibson said. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So I ask people, to answer your question, Kyle, be conscious. Be aware of this, what this means. Be aware of what it means for your kids when they go to college and what they're studying. What are they going to be studying? Well, they'll have a job in 20 years. That's very personal. But I think that the only way we get at this is by people making good decisions in their own best interest. And we don't have a great history of doing that. Now is the time to do that.
You know, Kyle, although Marv is trained as a psychologist, I often describe him as as a technological philosopher, because I think we've heard some of that today. Your focus on people and wanting to be responsive to people is something that I think technologists sometimes miss badly. And I appreciate your wisdom on all of this, Marv. I hope that the people who hear and watch and read this interview will take to heart the things you've been talking with us about. This is a decidedly different interview than the kind we've had in the past, but it's taking a human perspective in a different direction than we had in the past. And I think at this stage of history, it's some very valuable lessons in what you've said. I want to thank you for joining us today.
Ron and Kyle, I really appreciate this opportunity. It's not often that you get to talk to people who you don't know about something this important. And I hope I've left people with one takeaway, and that's that they need to pay attention to what's going on. It's very easy for life to distract, but this may simply be the most important thing that humanity's ever dealt with. If it's not, good. If it is, everybody has to prepare for it.
That's a great point. Absolutely. I agree with that.
So
Great.
thank you for the opportunity.
Yep.
Absolutely.